Um, China in Central Asian gas. Before starting my presentation, I would actually want to ask you. I will try to focus on both export-import relationships between Central Asian countries and China, and also some domestic developments. Okay? I will. Well, this time, usually when I have my presentation, I have lots of statistics, right? But I found out that not many people do really memorize all the data that I provide. So I would like to have the seminar more, to some extent, in an interactive form. Okay? Right? Basically, of course, that was a very valid comment, right? In what sense? What do we mean by reliable? The Soviet Union collapsed. Natural gas export still played an important role for Central Asian countries. Okay? Not that much for Kazakhstan, perhaps, but for Uzbekistan, and most importantly for Turkmenistan. In the 1990s, Turkmenistan produced 88 billion cubic meters of gas. Consumed only 8 billion cubic meters of gas, which means 80 billion cubic meters of gas was exported to Russia and then through Russian pipeline network to Ukraine and Eastern Europe. Okay, so the natural gas export-import relations was extremely important. However, what form did this relationships take? When it comes to the payment mechanism and whether the Central Asian countries were happy about export-import relationships with Russia, the answer is definitely no, right? But what choice did they have in the 1990s, right? So there were only two options: either to cancel all the relationships, stop the relationships. So what would Turkmenistan do with its natural gas at that time? Probably nothing. So Russia was the only alternative. Of course, when it comes to the form of the negotiations and the export-import relationships, Central Asian countries were not happy, especially Turkmenistan. So what form was it? That was the barter form, the bartering, like it was in the Soviet Union. Turkmenistan supplied 80 billion cubic meters of gas. Since 1991, the export volume never reached that level. Okay? So it has been decreasing since then. And Russia in return provided Turkmenistan with goods. Clothing, food, right? However, gaining independence, the Turkmen leaders, as well as the leader of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, they decided that bartering system does not really serve their national interest. So they started to ask for money. Of course, Russia said no at the very beginning, and this negotiation process has taken a lot of time. In the early 2000s, 10 years later, Central Asian countries, they somehow succeeded to renegotiate the payment mechanism with the Russian Federation. So Russia agreed to pay 40% in money and 60% in goods. 40% in money, that was actually significant, right? For the economy of Turkmenistan. However, the relationships themselves, they were not reliable or fair from the Central Asian countries' perspective. Sapar Murat Niyazov, the first president of Turkmenistan, he once highlighted, why should Turkmenistan export natural gas to Russia for $32 per thousand cubic meters, while Russia is re-exporting Central Asian gas for $42 per thousand cubic meters. And in the late 90s, early 2000s, that was a significant amount of money, right? So, these relationships, Russia has taken advantage of the Central Asian countries' dependence on Russia and the Russian infrastructure for a long period of time. The first year, when Russia agreed to pay 100% in money for Central Asian natural resources, was 2006. 2005, 2006. Okay, but even at that time, the relationships were not reliable and fair. And again, from the Central Asian countries' perspective, Russia, of course, made a lot of money out of this and used Central Asian natural resources for some geopolitical, for political purposes. But when it comes to numbers, in 2006, Russia paid $100 per thousand cubic meters of Central Asian gas and re-exported to Europe, not directly, of course, when I say re-exported, Russia used Central Asian gas to supply its southern regions, right? And the availability of gas in gas-producing regions allowed Russian government to export more gas to Europe, okay? But exported natural gas to the European countries for $250, right? So it wasn't fair. Imagine $150 loss, basically, per 1,000 cubic meters of gas. So Russia wasn't really reliable from the Central Asian countries' perspective. Even in 2007, when the new president of Turkmenistan and the leaders of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, they started openly raising this question again and saying that we don't want to be discriminated, right? So you have to pay us a fair price. So the Russian leaders agreed, because at that time both the European countries and the China and the South Asian countries, they started to show interest. South Asian countries backed by the United States, the European countries who are the consumers of natural gas, and at that time they expected to increase the natural gas consumption in the country, and of course China, who also started to suffering from insufficient natural consumption. But we all remember Russia-Ukraine crisis. Remember the gas crisis? 80% of the Russian gas reached Europe through Ukraine. Ukraine started to use this leverage to push on, some political interest, or as well as economic, on the Russian government, right? And because of this conflict, the natural gas export from Russia, and consequently from the Central Asian countries, significantly dropped. And when I say significantly dropped, basically I mean Turkmenistan. Remember, Turkmenistan has always been the most important natural gas exporting country from the region. Why not Uzbekistan and why not Kazakhstan? So if you look at these lines, you see the sharp drop. This from Turkmenistan, because Turkmenistan was the largest contributor to natural gas export. And then we had Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. Who do you think was the largest producer of natural gas at the time? Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan produced around 55-60 billion cubic meters of gas. But in case of Uzbekistan, because of the large domestic consumption, Uzbekistan consumes almost all the gas it produces. Okay? But what about Kazakhstan? Why do you think the natural gas relationships between Russia and Kazakhstan remain stable throughout, from the time of gaining independence, the country? Why? Why we have these fluctuations in Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan? So you see, dropping down. And then when it comes to Kazakhstan, no major changes.
Good question. Good question, actually.
Yes?
Because we have a deal agreement for using our
Production.
Yeah, production. We sent our gas from Karachaganak to Orenburg processing plant, so getting it back, this amount is stable. That's why there's no significant drop up or down.
Exactly, right? So Kazakhstan has never been an exporting country in its bold sense, if we can put it this way, right? Karachaganak is the largest gas producing field in Kazakhstan, and 10 billion cubic meters of gas from this Karachaganak is being exported to Orenburg gas processing plant in Russia. The gas is being processed, and then 90% of this processed gas is returned back to Kazakhstan, right? So this is a joint venture between Russian and Kazakhstani companies, right? So not really an exporting country, and that's why these relationships, they did not suffer significant loss. I think this line drop in here, this is the problem of me typing in data in here.
Not zero.
No, my fault, right? Typing in, because there was no significant drop in there.
Oh.
So it still continues. Okay? So, Central Asian countries, they were not that much happy about Russia. And we wanted to reach other external markets, diversify. Many countries at that time showed interest. As I said, China, the European Union, actually the European Union, Trans-Caspian gas pipeline project has been on the agenda for the last 25 years. as well as the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan and India, South Asian direction. However, only China succeeded to challenge the Russian monopoly. Of course, we have two pipelines going to Iran, but the country that succeeded to challenge Russian monopoly was China. In 2006, why do you think that 2006, 5 and 6 is the time when China started negotiating with Central Asian countries regarding the natural gas import from the region? What does 2005 and 6 signify? Why 2005 and 6? Why not before? Why not 1995 like in case of TAPI? Why not 1990s like in case of Trans-Caspian pipeline? Because China is the largest producer of natural gas itself. However, because of the growing economy, the natural gas consumption in 2005 exceeded the natural gas production domestically, right? So, and because China started using more gas than it produces, it started looking for alternative markets. Okay? Of course, Central Asian countries were one of the best options.
Actually, it should have looked before it exceeded. So
yes, but then I think China has been considering this issue for a long time.
Okay.
But they started negotiations, right?
Okay.
They started talking about, let's say, oil. Oil import from Central Asian countries, from Kazakhstan, in the 1990s, right? So the agreement, if I'm not mistaken, was signed to build Atasu-Alashanko oil pipeline, was signed in 1997, right? So it was 1997. It's just they finished building in 2004 and started import. But they, in the 1990s, were showing interest for the energy resources of the region. But the direct negotiations, they started in 2006, signing memorandums and the construction. Perhaps China, considering their pragmatic approach, they realized that the Central Asian countries, they would agree on the Chinese terms, right? So China provides easy loans, no strings attached most of the time, and interestingly, while the European and the American South Asian project had been on the agenda for the last 25 years, China succeeded to build this pipeline networks in a very short time. In 2008, the agreement was signed and the construction of the first line, line A, started. In 2009, this line A was completed with the length of almost 2,000 kilometers. In 2009, I think, or they started the construction process for the second line, and they finished in 2011. And they finished the third line in 2015, right? So, why do you guys think, what do you think, let's put it this way, what do you think, why China succeeded to win the race for the Central Asian natural resources? Was it the political conditions? Was it the economic factor?
Probably economic.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, as you said, you have just answered. I mean, the costs are limited. The Chinese offers are much more attractive for the Central Asian politicians and the state elites, probably, or any other.
Anyone else? Come on, guys, let's just throw out different arguments. Say something out. Oh, look, Genghis definitely has something in mind.
Because you previously mentioned that Central Asian countries wanted to diversify their export routes.
Yeah.
So that's why they were interested to have alternative pipelines to Russia.
But why didn't they build a South Asian corridor, for example, linking Turkmenistan with Afghanistan, Pakistan and India? Why couldn't they build a Trans-Caspian gas pipeline, which is just 300 miles in length and could have, you know, been constructed in a very short time?
I think Caspian, because of there is a, I think it's not, we didn't define the legal status of Caspian Sea, and through Afghanistan because of security.
Security.
Yeah, very good. And I think all these answers are valid, right? So that was the combination of political, economic, you know, security, all these factors and issues. For Russia, the European Union is the priority #1 in its foreign energy policy. European Union for Russia is a priority #1 when it comes to the energy market, right? So Russia would never allow Central Asian countries, using its political and economic leverage at the time, to build the pipeline bypassing Russian territory to reach the European Union, because in this case, the dependence of the European countries on Russia would decrease, right? Geopolitical kind of aspect. In here, Russia could not basically afford importing Central Asian gas at the volume that it agreed, because of the Russia-Ukraine gas crisis. Russia just didn't need Central Asian gas at the time, right? But because Central Asian countries are so highly dependent on natural gas export and the revenues, Russia also could not say no to the Central Asian countries, because that would collapse Central Asian economies, right? And of course, the South Asian direction, we have the United States factor here as well. The security issues in Afghanistan are one of the major challenges. And here comes China. China is very interested. China does not pose direct threat to the Russian ambitions and kind of geopolitical goals, right? China is ready to offer Central Asian countries what they want the most, which is hard currency, right? Basically pay the money. And that's how China succeeded to jump in, engage in the Central Asian natural gas sector. However, we all know that, yes?
Yeah, just before passing by this, the previous slide, you have said that the falling into the same trap.
Yeah.
So what does it mean? I mean,
I'm going to explain it just in a second. Yeah, actually it was linked to the second,
okay.
to the next slide.
Okay.
But this is a very good comment. Falling into the same trap. So, what did Central Asian countries, what were they afraid of the most? This excessive dependence on the single infrastructure, on a single political actor, which was Russia. And Central Asian countries, they suffered significant consequence, like impact of this dependence. So they wanted to diversify. When they have now, I'm talking about now, when Central Asian countries have diversified their export routes, now we can reach Russia. 5 pipeline networks, Central Asia Center. The capacity has decreased twofold because of the outdated infrastructure, but still accounts for 45 billion cubic meters of gas, and that's huge. Turkmenistan has built 2 natural gas pipelines connecting Turkmenistan with Iran, 20 billion cubic meters of capacity. Now we have pipeline networks to reach China. We can use the Caspian Sea and some kind of swap deals with external actors. We have diversified infrastructure and the routes. But the fact that starting from 2017, January the 1st, Turkmenistan is exporting almost all its gas to the Chinese direction only. Uzbekistan has almost decreased to 0 its gas export to Russia and planning to increase gas export only in the Chinese direction, right? Kazakhstan is exporting gas to Russia the same way it did before, but as I explained, it's not really exporting, right? The gas is being processed there and then returned back to Kazakhstan. But all the new capacities, they are expected to head towards the Chinese direction. 5 billion cubic meters of gas from Kazakhstan, 10 billion cubic meters of gas from Uzbekistan, 65 billion cubic meters of gas from Turkmenistan. This is the agreement that the Central Asian countries signed with China. And they were supposed to reach 65 billion cubic meters of gas export already by 2018. Okay? And by 2020, reach 80-85 billion cubic meters of gas. Falling into the same trap. Now we have diversified routes, but unfortunately all the gas is heading in one direction. Right? Falling into the same trap. Before we had Russian monopoly, now we have Chinese monopoly. What's the difference? So I have highlighted several different kind of issues. Quasi-transit status and the energy hungry. Which one of this Russia, which one of this China? What do you think?
China.
Russia, China, exactly, right? So, Russia never needed Central Asian gas for domestic consumption. Russia needed Central Asian gas to increase export to the European countries. If European countries are not buying more gas, then I don't need the Central Asian gas. Okay? So, pretty simple. Central Asian countries are quite vulnerable. Because their future, their economy is dependent on the politics between Russia, Ukraine, and European countries, right? When it comes to China, the situation is different. China's economy is growing, and China is in need of more gas, more energy, right? Which adds stability and reliability. So China is more reliable than Russia, because China needs Central Asian gas, right? Russia doesn't. So China is energy-hungry country. Russia is just a transit country. Old infrastructure and the new infrastructure. Russia never invested a lot of money in building those infrastructure, right? So Russia inherited from the Soviet Union. And in the Soviet Union we had a different government, right? So neither Yeltsin nor Putin invested money in building those infrastructure. And the infrastructure is outdated, it has to be modernized, which requires lots of money.
Is it also applicable for Russia's other pipelines? Because I mean, this old infrastructure and the inherited infrastructure only applies to the Central Asia and
mostly.
Yeah.
Because Russia is building new pipeline infrastructure to bypass Ukraine and Belarus, right? This
And
Nord Stream.
Yeah, and the Blue Stream.
Yes, exactly.
And
They are new. But we have the Soyuz, for example, gas pipeline infrastructure which goes through Ukraine and Belarus. Those are old as well.
Old, yeah.
Yes,
So most of them are
old. Built during the Soviet time. In Central Asia, Russia wanted to build a new pipeline, which was called pre-Caspian gas pipeline, to increase up to 15 and then 20 or 25 billion cubic meters of gas from Turkmenistan to Russia, right? It wanted. But then, after the Russia-Ukraine gas crisis, basically Russia decided to abandon, or at least put aside this project. Okay? So, no new major project has been built, pipelines, by the Russians. If you never invested a lot of money, of course you don't really, how to say, investing money determines commitment. If you invested money, then you want it back. You would like to return it. Or at least you would want to make sure that this pipeline works in its full capacity. If you never invested, if you just inherited, okay, today it works, tomorrow if it doesn't, who cares? Maybe the day after tomorrow we'll try to revive it. But when it comes to China, it's a completely different issue. China spent huge amount of money in building those infrastructure. The infrastructure is new. Actually, Central Asia China pipeline is considered to be the longest in the world because it is supposed to have 4 lines, each 1,833 kilometers. If you add them all, so it makes the longest pipeline infrastructure in the world. And the cost of each line accounts for $7 billion. According to the agreement, China covers 50%, Central Asian countries cover the other 50%. However, because Central Asian countries do not have money, they took loan, and China sponsored 100% construction of these pipelines and signed an agreement, production sharing agreement, which implies that Central Asian countries would return investments in resources. This very same fact determines the commitment. China would try to make sure that these pipelines work in their full capacity, right? Because too much money is invested, too much energy is invested, and China needs energy resources for its economy. Okay? Here we go. These are major differences between monopolies of Russia and China over Central Asian natural gas. But the question comes, do you think that China is now more reliable or fair partner towards Central Asian countries than Russia?
Because if we take, for instance, example of Turkmenistan, their only export is to China, and as you say, they cannot, they are not taking money for their gas because they have to return money.
Oh, of course they are.
So they have a good leverage on.
Excellent point. Anyone else? Just say something crazy. Just say it out. Yeah.
Well, Central Asia is dependent on the rate of economic growth in China. I mean, if there is some decrease, China doesn't want more energy, and
exactly.
There will be some decline, right? In demand.
Absolutely.
And also China, during the process of negotiating on the prices issues, according to agreement, the price was lower than it was on world price on average, and that's why even exporting to Russia it will be more. How to say? The budget will be budget revenues from gas from export to Russia will be more than budget revenues from export to China.
Yeah.
And also, as actually was mentioned, they actually need to cover their loans and credits.
Yeah. Return the investment.
Yes.
Exactly.
Well, Russia can also be considered as more reliable than in the 1990s because it's losing its monopoly in the European markets. So nowadays I think that they're more eager to negotiate with us.
Well, you know everything. Thank you. Exactly. I mean, all these factors. So basically, we have lots of consequences, right? Or let's put it a different way. There are lots of risks for Central Asian countries now when they are almost 100% or extremely highly dependent on the Chinese market, on the single Chinese market. Okay, but the relationships are not as stable as either China or Central Asian countries expected. Actually, as I said, according to the agreements in 2015, it was expected when the third pipeline is built, then 55 billion cubic meters of gas would be exported to China, right? In 2018, they were hoping that the fourth line would be completed and the overall export capacity would reach 65 billion cubic meters. By 2020, all four pipelines would operate in their full capacity, which would account for 85 billion cubic meters of gas, almost. Okay? However, China is not receiving this gas. It's not receiving the amount of gas that the China wanted. Okay? So, Uzbekistan decreased natural gas export to all the neighboring countries. Tajikistan stopped exporting natural gas to Tajikistan in 2030, as well as to Kyrgyzstan. There had been several gas supply shortages to southern part of Kazakhstan. Okay, Uzbekistan is extremely tight when it comes to domestic natural gas consumption, and Uzbekistan is trying to increase natural gas exports, which is supposed to be heading towards the Chinese direction. But do you know how much natural gas was exported from Uzbekistan in 2016? It was supposed to export 10 billion cubic meters of gas, but they barely reached 3 billion cubic meters of gas. Okay? Turkmenistan was supposed to export almost 40 billion cubic meters of gas and more in 2014, 15, and now it had to reach over 50 billion cubic meters of gas. But in fact, Turkmenistan exported around 35 billion cubic meters of gas in 2017 and less than 29,000 billion cubic meters of gas in 2016. Which means Turkmenistani gas export or all these pipelines are not operating in their full capacity. Whose fault is that? Right? Is this the fault of China? Is this the problem for Central Asian countries? What are the reasons? And by the way, Kazakhstan is supposed to export 5 billion cubic meters of gas. It exported 300 million cubic meters in 2016. 5 billion, 300 million. So you see the difference? Central Asian gas export to China is not reaching the agreed and the contracted volume. And we have several reasons for this. First of all, there is no natural gas production boom in Central Asian countries. Okay? So the only country which has lots of natural gas, that's Turkmenistan. But for some reason Turkmenistan is not really hurrying in terms of natural gas production. Okay, so and we'll talk about the reasons. Uzbekistan simply doesn't have gas. Uzbekistan consumes almost as much as it produces. Almost everything itself. No major natural gas fields has been opened, discovered or exploited this past 10 years. Okay? And in Kazakhstan we know that the gas here is associated gas. By the way, do you know that Kazakhstani government has this general scheme for gasification of the country from 2015 up until 2030, and it was supposed that the domestic consumption would decrease from 10 billion cubic meters up until 18 billion cubic meters, and we had the list of different regions right? And they were supposed to be gasified by 2030, some of them up until like 100% gasified, but all the initiatives failed. And the reason is that the government is the only or the most important actor who took the obligations and the commitment. I looked at the scheme and the document, and it says that the sources financing should come from the government, international institutions, and the private sector. However, the government was basically the main contributor. When the oil price started to fall down, the Kazakhstan economy started suffering, and then the government ended up having no money for gasification initiatives. And that's why the gasification initiative, I would say, is currently failed in Kazakhstan. But that's, okay, a little bit different issues. So, when it comes to the consequences of the Central Asian countries' dependence on external single market. The first one, export at the expense of domestic consumption. The clear example is Uzbekistan, right? And I would also say perhaps Kazakhstan. Why? Which line do you think is designed to export natural gas to China? Or? I think I'm making this confusing. This is the Kazakhstani territory. Most of the natural gas in Kazakhstan is located in the western part, because the gas is associated, right? Where the oil reserves, the gas reserves are. The Mangistau region, for example. We have the Central Asia-China pipeline. Kazakhstan has obligation to export 5 billion cubic meters of gas, right? Where do Kazakhstan get this gas from? Where does Kazakhstan get this gas? Kashagan, but most importantly, Mangistau region, basically in here, right? So Kazakhstan has built Bozoy-Binev-Shymkent from the western part of the country, yes? You may correct me. Oh, in here, yes. Actually, this is the part now. Kızılar'da, Mangistau, okay? Right? So from here, Bozoy-Binev-Shymkent is the pipeline network which is supposed to transport gas, Kazakhstani gas, from the western regions to the southern part of Kazakhstan, leave 10 billion cubic meters for domestic consumption, export 5 billion cubic meters to China. Bozoy-Binev-Shymkent pipeline was built for the Chinese money. Again, based on the production sharing agreement, which means China has to return its investments, right? Return investments in resources. So, until Kazakhstan boosts natural gas production, which would reach the level capable of meeting both domestic needs and the Chinese needs, I think China would push a little bit to import more gas, even at the expense of domestic consumption in the south. Okay? So these are some of the risks which I think, as an analyst, we should take into account. Uzbekistan is a major problem, and here comes to Turkmenistan. Why do you think Turkmenistan doesn't want to increase the natural gas export to China? The government, a couple years ago, I remember reading Turkmenistani websites, the government's websites, looking for primary data, and according to the country development strategy, they wanted to increase the natural gas production inside the country up until 230 billion cubic meters per year by 2020 or 25. I don't remember. 30, let's put it. But now Turkmenistan produces what? Like less than 60, around 60 billion cubic meters of gas? 65. 35 or is being consumed domestically, the rest is exported to China. But Turkmenistan doesn't want to export more natural gas to China. Why?
Low prices. Low price.
Exactly, low prices, right? So because China is returning investments, China pays the lowest price to Turkmenistan compared to other suppliers. China is receiving natural gas from Iran, liquefied natural gas. China is receiving natural gas from Myanmar. China is receiving natural gas in the liquefied form from Australia, major suppliers, and Turkmenistan. But China, I don't know the exact breakdown of the pricing, but some sources, they were saying that the average price that the China pays for natural gas, for 1,000 cubic meters, is $200. Turkmenistan is receiving 180 something. $20, it's nothing, right? So perhaps it's just the lunch money. But when it comes to the billions of cubic meters of gas, right, this is important. This is a lot of money. Okay, so because China is the only market for Turkmenistan that has left, and China is not paying that much money, and China is returning its investments, Turkmenistan is not really interested in increasing the export capacity to China, right? At the same time, Dauren was exactly right that the Central Asian countries' export capacity is also dependent on the Chinese domestic market. In 2010, all the analysts, they were forecasting that the natural gas consumption in China would, you know, like go up like this. But then starting from 2014, the natural gas consumption rate increase started, you know, basically slow down.
To flat.
Yeah, right? To flat a little bit. Which means China is also not very much interested. It is interested, of course, but not at the same level as it was when they were signing agreements. And they signed agreements in 2012, I think the last one, which said Turkmenistan has to increase export up to 65 billion cubic meters. But it was 6 years ago, and the time flies, and the economy changes, and the oil and the gas markets, energy markets are changing, and all the conditions, they are also changing. Okay, so this is also one of the major issues why Turkmenistan doesn't really want to export more natural gas to China. Can other alternative projects, considering all these geopolitical, geoeconomic issues, be implemented?
Tapi?
TAPI, yeah, Trans-Caspian. No?
No new gas.
Exactly, right, exactly. In Turkmenistan, the largest producer, where do you think you know, Turkmenistan gets its gas from at this time? Yeah, so that's basically Galkanish, right?
The eastern part of the country?
Yes,
Oh,
it's
okay.
eastern part of the country.
Okay.
Turkmenistan has built in 2015 east-west gas pipeline with the capacity of 30 billion cubic meters of gas. Turkmenistan was hoping that by developing Galkanish will increase the gas production capacity up to 200 billion cubic meters of gas, which would be enough to supply both China and Europe. So they built this pipeline domestic, connecting eastern part with its natural gas to the western part of the country, leaving the only missing section, which is the Caspian Sea. Right? So they were hoping that when this dispute over the Caspian Sea is resolved, this pipeline would be built immediately and they start exporting natural gas to Europe, avoiding Russian territory. They finished the pipeline, but it's not really operational at this moment. Okay, so alternative projects, simply no gas. In Turkmenistan, Galkanish is being developed for the Chinese money, basically. China is paying a lot of, Japan paid $2 billion in 2011 or 10. But since then, the largest contribution is Chinese companies, right? Why would China invest a lot of money in increasing gas production so that Turkmenistan would start exporting to Pakistan and India? If this is an economic and a business project, perhaps China would go for it. Like CPEC, China-Pakistani relationships, right? The energy issues. For China, CPEC project is economic. Turkmenistan and natural gas, this is not purely economic. This is energy security project. Why would China increase or invest money in providing the conditions for Turkmen government to export gas to its competitor? Probably not. Why would China invest more money in increasing the production capacity so that Turkmenistan would increase gas export to Europe? Right? So, when the Chinese government sees some economic benefits, probably Chinese government would go for it. But not at this moment. Other than that, there is simply no gas for all this alternative project. Do you think the line D would be constructed? Remember, I said China, you know, supposedly signed agreements to build 4 lines. 3 starting from Turkmenistan, going through Uzbekistan, then Kazakhstan, and reaching China. The 4th one is expected to go like this. From Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and then China. But the 4th line last year was, you know, postponed for undetermined time, whatever was the formulation, right? So, do you think the line D will be constructed soon. And why not?
Well, probably not.
Why not?
Well, you didn't mention this in your presentation, but I've heard that somewhere in the southern Chinese Sea, they found a new source of natural gas in the bottom of this ocean. Well, some estimates have shown that these are very significant amounts of gas, and probably China will cover its demand for extracting these gases from the bottom of the sea.
Yeah, but then we have the eastern part of the China and the western part of the China, right? Like in here.
So are there,
There is one pipeline network linking eastern part with the western part, but the capacity is not that high, right? So all the gas being discovered in here would go for the natural gas demand in the eastern part, the largest industrial regions of the country. But when it comes to the western part of the country, which also needs natural gas for economic development, right? So all this 85 billion cubic meters of gas would probably end up being here. They would want to increase the natural gas production, or if 85 billion cubic meters of gas continuously goes to the western part, then they will try to transport this gas to the eastern part of the country. But now at this moment. So this is a very valid and important comment, right? But I don't really think this is directly linked to the failure of the Line D.
maybe because of some intrastate relations between Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan?
But why would China, you know, in the first place, propose this direction? The Line D, right? They knew about this conflict, or conflict is there for a long time. And of course there is no definite answer, and that's why I'm throwing this question out for discussion, so that perhaps we might come up with something that makes sense. What I have in mind is that this Line D had more strategic importance rather than energy security. Because they could have built the fourth line along the street. They have the route built, everything is there, it's just put another line and that's it. But they decided to build the fourth line through Uzbekistan and then go into Tajikistan and then Kyrgyzstan and China, passing all this water energy conflicting countries in the region. And China has always been avoiding this conflict, right? So why would China do this? My understanding and my perception is that, you know, all the energy source or all the energy routes from the region, they pass Kazakhstani territory. Oil pipeline from Kazakhstan to China. All three lines from Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and then Kazakhstan to China. And we know that Kazakhstan is part of the Eurasian Economic Union. Kazakhstan is highly under the sometimes pressure of the Russian Federation, right? And China and Russia, these are regional or to some extent global, latently competing powers, right? So perhaps strategically China was afraid that all the routes they pass through the territory of Kazakhstan, which is under not the control, but when it comes, pressure from the Russian Federation. Right? And Russia has its own natural gas projects. Perhaps Russia could have used its leverage to block this project so that the Russian-China projects would go ahead. Right? So China, to secure itself, decided also to use the diversification strategy and proposed the fourth line, which would bypass Kazakhstani territory. There is no way that you can avoid Uzbekistan, unfortunately, right? But then you can avoid Kazakhstan. And they wanted to build this fourth line.
So what is the reason behind the failure, I mean, so far?
I think this project failed last year because Tajikistan already started building this, but last year Uzbekistan said no, we are frozen it. The leadership changed in Uzbekistan. The new leader is getting very close to the Russian Federation, right? And the Putin himself. So now not only Kazakhstan but also Uzbekistan is also in close ties with Russia. Before Islam Karimov, he was unpredictable. He had his own stance, right? He always had something in mind, and he could easily abrupt stop the relationships. But not the new president. So perhaps China realized that the strategic significance of this pipeline basically is no longer that relevant. Okay?
And then you cannot fill the three lines. Why do you build?
Exactly. Yeah. And other than that, when there is not enough gas, natural gas to fill the three lines, why would China invest more money in building the fourth one? Okay, so in combination all these issues, they are the reasons why the fourth line is not being built at this moment. So how can we solve this issue? This is the main mechanism for China to engage in energy relationships with Central Asian countries, bilateral arrangements. Everything is being conducted along these bilateral arrangements. All the agreements are signed bilaterally. Investment flow comes bilaterally. Of course, let's jump this through. There is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This organization is being used as the framework of regional cooperation in the region, right? So China is claiming that they are using, this is a little bit old date, like map. Now India and Pakistan, they are also part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But China is using this framework to promote regional projects. Those are regional projects. But to what extent Shanghai Cooperation Organization is an effective framework? To what extent SCO is an effective mechanism? Is it?
No, because the decisions are made in
Bilaterally?
no.
It's a loose agreement, isn't it? I mean,
I wouldn't say so. Now, if you look, it's like, 4 nuclear powers are in this organization, and
yeah, but I don't know, the institutionalization of the organization is not so,
exactly.
how can I say, imposing or...
Yeah. Within the organization, the only agency specifically created to regulate energy relationships is the Energy Club. And the Energy Club is the recommendation for type institution, right? So it just forms recommendations how to behave. No enforcement power whatsoever. Lots of regional agreements, kind of memorandums are signed, highlighting that we want to promote regional relationships, regional framework. But when it comes to granting the only agency and enforcement power, China, as well as Central Asian countries or Russia, for the sake of the argument, does not want to lose its autonomy in determining foreign energy policies. And they are not granting this organization any enforcement power. But I think in the future there will be some changes, in the near future. Why? They were hoping that the commitment from the greater power side would ensure full compliance with the terms of the agreements, right? So if China is highly interested in importing Central Asian countries' gas, then these pipelines could work in their full capacity. No questions about it. What we are observing today, this is not the case, right? So China is failing to force Central Asian countries to comply, fully comply with the terms of agreements. So bilateral arrangements perhaps are not the best way to go. And the China realizes that Central Asian countries, they also have bilateral agreements with Russia. Yet these agreements could not stop the supply disruption in the Russian direction, right? Turkmenistan had agreements with Iran. And now they are taking this issue up to the arbitrary court, trying to solve the price disputes because natural gas, Turkmenistan stopped exporting gas to Iran, claiming that you owe us money. So all these issues, regional issues, cannot be solved bilaterally. No mechanism for solving disputes is there, basically, truly effective. So perhaps I'm not saying that this SCO would grant the Energy Club any sort of enforcement power. But I think there is a need for reconsideration of these relationships. And as it was believed before, bilateral arrangements on their own are not the best or the most reliable. Arrangements do not guarantee that Central Asian countries or China, for example, would comply fully with all these agreements.
Yeah, I also agree that bilateral agreements maybe cannot be the scenario for future, but also a single arrangement for regulating the whole energy markets or interstate energy transfers by a single institution of Shanghai members is not a viable option because, I mean, it's so vast, it's so diversified from Belarus to India's eastern territories. So I think the best, possible option would be groupings. So not in a way of including all the members, but like in European Union, like a la carte Europe or multi-speed Europe, so some countries can engage themselves into groupings that better serve for their interests.
Unfortunately, yeah.
I don't know, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, just throwing up.
Yeah, that's actually very good. Well, some food for thought, right? But in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the decisions are made on the consensus based. So it doesn't really matter whether you're China with this huge economy or Russia with this huge territory. Every country has single vote, right? As well as Central Asian countries, and that's a problem, right? So Shanghai Cooperation Organization doesn't have its own bank, SCO bank, whatever, right? So most of the decisions are being, or most of the projects are being financed by the SCO consortium. So it's a little bit different. If there is no as financial source of the organization which would promote regional projects with less strings attached when it comes to bilateral or like state interests, then how can we talk about the future or some progress in this direction, right? So my point is that China is giving out most of the money, not the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. China is giving the money. If the SCO had its own bank with different contributions, right, then the SCO bank would have paid for regional projects. But now China is paying. And the problem here is that Chinese economic growth and the Chinese money makes China the largest contributor, right? But China would not agree to the consensus-based decision-making when it comes to using 70% of the budget, which belongs to China, right? Russia is strongly against the SCO bank because Russia feels that if China gains more power in terms of determining which project would be implemented because China is paying for it, that would diminish Russian role in the organization. And unless they create the single financial institution which would promote regional projects, I don't really think that we can really think of an effective, truly sustainable regional energy governance within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
What do you think about regional cooperation within the so-called Eurasian community? I mean, the concept of creating common oil and gas markets also in terms of supply and transit agreements, because they have actually planned.
Yes, I think the Eurasian, the common energy markets within the Eurasian Economic Union will be formed only when the question of keeping the union afloat comes to the agenda, right? So, because I can explain. The Eurasian Economic Union has different kind of codes and the list of items which are supposed to be traded or transported free of tariffs, custom tariffs, within the Union, right? The Group 27 contains the list of items of energy and mineral resources. Out of over 60 different types of items, and they are all being regulated by the Union regulation system, and no custom tariffs are being applied to them. Only 6 fall out of this, and I can list them. That's crude oil, oil products, natural gas in the gasified form, that's electricity, that's coal, and I think uranium or something. All the major strategically important energy resources, they are not being regulated by the Eurasian Economic Union, right? So why is that? The first reason is Russia against the formation of the common energy market. At the very beginning, actually, Russia, I would say, bribed, or they made this false promise to Kazakhstan and Belarus that if you join the Eurasian, or let's form the Eurasian Economic Union, and then you will benefit. Belarus imports Russian oil, has extensive oil refinery capacity, right? And used to, in this shadow economy, re-export refined oil products from the Russian oil to the European countries, and made lots of money. Kazakhstan wanted the Eurasian Economic Union, or let's put it this way, 80% of Kazakhstani oil export goes to Europe through the Russian territory. Hypothetically, Kazakhstan has to pay the tariff fees for crossing, right? Russian territory, the transit fees and some custom tariff fees. But if oil and gas has been regulated by the Eurasian Economic Union according to all those conditions, then Kazakhstan would be able to export oil directly to the European countries using Russia and Belarus and other countries just simply as a transit territory. Right? So of course this is a huge leverage in the Russian government's hands. And Russian government doesn't really want to give this leverage up. And besides, we all know how the budget is being distributed, right? So it's like 78.6% goes to the Russian budget because this is the largest exporting country. But if they also start regulating oil and natural gas, like the energy sectors, and this is the main source of income for the Russian Federation, then it means even if Kazakhstan is receiving, is it 9%? 7 something percent, or Belarus is receiving the rest, this much. But if you add the money from oil and gas export, that would significantly increase the payment to the Belarus government, the budget, or Kazakhstan, or Armenia, for example. 0.7%, but still it goes. It's a lot of money, right? So of course, creating common oil and gas and electricity markets bear huge financial as well as geopolitical cost for the Russian government. And that is why the Russian government is using all its leverage to push this projects a little bit aside. Yeah. When it comes to the electricity market, this is a huge problem, right? So to have common electricity market, you have to have interlinked power transmission lines and the networks, right? And there is no interlinked power transmission lines on the Eurasian, and at least for Central Asian countries and Russia, right? So Kyrgyzstan is absolutely isolated. Southern part of Kazakhstan is a little bit linked to the northern part of Kazakhstan, but the network is not that huge, right? Kazakhstan, because of its territory from the Soviet time, had 3 different loosely connected power grids. Okay. Southern part was part of the Central Asian power grid, northern part was part of the Russian power grid, and the western part it basically operated on its own a little bit and linked to the Russian, right? Okay. So Kyrgyzstan is completely isolated. If Tajikistan joins, it will also be completely isolated. How would Russia ensure the smooth transition and power supply relationships within the Union territory, which is loosely connected to each other by infrastructure? And of course, Russia doesn't have money to rebuild or build a new infrastructure system. So they can form the common electricity market by 2019, but what good will this do? Besides, all these countries, they are members of the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, right? So CIS has a lot of different agreements regulating electricity transit and supply relationships. So everything that the Eurasian Economic Union is going to offer has been imprinted to some extent in the documents of the CIS. But CIS has the same problem of disconnected electricity grids, right? Problem of financing, right? And the problem of commitment or enforcement mechanism. No progress.
So still, it seems to me that Kazakhstan, like many other Central Asian countries, are still continue to be stuck in between Moscow and Beijing.
Basically we cannot avoid this. We are landlocked. The only reason would be if we had access to sea, right? And then the relationships and the geopolitics would be completely different. Yes. But because we are landlocked, we cannot avoid these 2 major neighbors. Yes. This or that way, they would always affect the relationship. The only thing to improve Central Asian countries' bargaining power vis-a-vis all those major powers is to unite a little bit. I'm not talking about reintegration of the Central Asian region, no. I'm talking about greater cooperation, right? So in all sense. If we cooperate, because all those projects, they have operational costs and they have security costs, right? And sometimes security cost is even more than the operational costs of those projects. And why do we have the security costs? Because we have internal problems most of the time, right? If we can solve this not domestic, but intra-Central Asian problems, then that would significantly decrease the security cost. And of course this is a very complex issue, but if we can show that this region is reliable, then we'll have a lot of external investors. Now why China and Russia are major investors? Because all those companies, they are linked to the government, right? And the government provides security and the guarantees, right? But in the West, there are lots of private sector. And the private sector is powerful. They have money, but they do not want to invest in the region with, to some extent, authoritarian regimes, right? Non-transparent, in some very low level corrupt. Yes. So if we can solve these issues, then perhaps we can have other alternatives. And when we have other alternatives, we can use these alternatives to bargain for better conditions with those countries.
So, I mean, so what do you think about this Caspian issue? I mean, if Caspian issue reaches a resolution of some type, will it be good for the Central Asian republics in order to bypass Russian impact towards reaching more easily to Western markets?
Well, I would say theoretically yes, and we see some progress in resolving the dispute over the legal status of the Caspian Sea. The problem is that, you know, when it comes to the energy sector, like exploring oil, extracting oil from beneath the Caspian Sea, I think this kind of sensitive issues, they will not be resolved even if the legal status is resolved by the countries, right? I think that when they reach this point, when they say, that, okay, the legal status is resolved, right? The problem is resolved. They would still keep the issue of exploring energy resources as a separate package of document. And they would say, if you want to build this pipeline, we have to reconsider it, right? And on the one hand, this is an economic issue, right? On the other hand, this is a geopolitical issue. But on the third part, this is environmental issue, right? So if two countries, for example, Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan, agree that this pipeline would lie only through the territory of Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan, right? But if the pipeline leaks, that would lead to the environmental and ecological problem which all 5 countries would suffer from this, right? So they can say that, excuse me, this is your territory, this is your territory, but if this pipeline can affect us as well, then you cannot simply disregard or avoid us, right? So for the energy, I think that would be a separate fight.
Yeah. So
questions? Oh yeah, my last slide is about thank you and questions.